Hello and welcome. My name is Darya Haitoglou. I'm a director of Virginia Satir Institute in the UK. It's a privilege to be here alongside so many individuals who have engaged with this model for decades. Today, I aim to present the culmination of several years of focused research, an in depth exploration of how the Satir model operates as both profoundly humanistic and evidence based approach to healing and transformation. For those familiar with this work, my intention is to provide fresh insights informed by data, lived experiences, and the ongoing integration with contemporary models and scientific advancements. Together, we will investigate how this model can serve as a beacon of hope in addressing the mental health challenges we face today. The Satir model, rooted in systemic therapy, encourages us to consider not only the individual but also the intricate web of relationships and systems in which we are situated. This holistic perspective is essential in our current context, where stressors extend beyond the personal to encompass societal dimensions. So, why mental health now? The Satir model meets the mental health crisis. We are living through a global mental health crisis. The World Health Organization estimates that 1 in 8 people live with a mental disorder, with stress, anxiety, and depression among the most common. Traditional treatments help but often fall short in cultivating inner resilience, connection, and growth. This is where the Satir model becomes not just relevant but urgent. It offers a humanistic, holistic approach that helps individuals transform, not just cope. My research set out to explore exactly how this model supports mental health in practical and measurable ways. So let's begin with something simple. What exactly was studied? To guide this research, I focused on three key questions. First, I wanted to understand the actual impact the Satir model had on treatment outcomes, specifically when it comes to stress, anxiety, and depression. Was it making a measurable difference in people's well being? Second, I explored which interventions were most commonly applied. Tools like family sculpting, or iceberg, parts party, and the five freedom. How were these tools used in practice to help relieve stress and anxiety? And third, I examined the implications for depressive symptoms. What kind of emotional shifts or systemic changes occurred when the model was applied in clinical or coaching settings? These questions help structure the evidence review and point toward what's working and why when the Satir model is used for mental health. So, this section is really about positioning, not just presenting data, but positioning the Satir model within the global psychotherapy conversation. For decades, the Satir model has been practiced, taught, and embodied. It has influenced family therapy, experiential therapy, systemic work, and yet, when we look at the academic landscape, something is missing. There has not been a structured synthesis that clarifies how this model functions as a transformational systemic framework across contexts. So, this research asked a very simple but profound question. If we gather the global evidence together, what does it show us about the nature of change in the Satir model? Not only whether it works, but how it works and how it travels across cultures. That is what we are doing here. We are positioning Satir not as a historic model, but as a living, evolving, global, relevant framework. Now, let me show you what the overview actually looked like. This review synthesized 21 empirical and conceptual studies published between 2002 and 2023. It was conducted as a PRISMA guided qualitative evidence synthesis in order to examine not simply outcomes but how the Satir model functions as a systemic transformational approach. The core aim was to move beyond the question of symptom reduction. Of course, reduction in anxiety, stress, and depression matters. But the deeper question was this: how does transformation actually unfold within the Satir model? How do intrapersonal shifts, relational reorganization, experiential processes, and meaning making interact to produce change? This review positions the Satir model not merely as a set of techniques, but as a coherent, multi layered transformational framework within contemporary systemic psychotherapy. This study was designed as a qualitative evidence synthesis guided by Prisma 2020. I chose this methodology intentionally. The Satir model is experiential, relational, and systemic. Its mechanisms of change are not purely cognitive and not easily captured through quantitative aggregation alone. So rather than asking only whether it works, I wanted to understand how transformation is described across studies. The aim was to integrate empirical findings and conceptual analysis in a structured way while preserving the depth, complexity, and systemic nature of Satir-informed practice. This approach allowed the model to be examined as a transformational framework, not merely a symptom reduction intervention. I conducted a systematic search across major databases, screening 5,923 records. After applying eligibility criteria, 21 studies published between 2002 and 2023 were included. The studies were methodologically diverse, including randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental designs, mixed method research, case studies, psychometric work, and conceptual analysis. All studies were appraised using CASP criteria. Data were synthesized through thematic analysis, leading to the identification of four interrelated domains of transformation. This approach allowed us to move beyond symptom reduction and map emotional, relational, somatic, and meaning level change across cultural and clinical contexts. Across the 21 studies, several Satir-informed interventions were repeatedly applied in the treatment of stress and anxiety. What is important is that these were not isolated techniques. They were embedded within a systemic and experiential framework. The interventions most commonly used included family sculpting, congruence, and communication stance work, parts exploration, guided experiential dialogue, and psychoeducational group programs. Rather than targeting anxiety directly as a symptom, these interventions worked by reorganizing emotional experience, relational patterns, and internal self perception. The focus was on restoring congruence, increasing emotional awareness, and shifting rigid survival responses that maintain anxiety. When examining how these interventions reduce stress and anxiety, several therapeutic processes emerged consistently across studies. First, emotional regulation improved through increased awareness and congruence. Clients learned to identify, own, and express feelings more clearly. Second, co regulation within relational systems played a central role. As communication became safer and more authentic, anxiety levels decreased. Third, experiential methods allowed access to suppressed or defended affect. This reduced internal tension and fragmentation. Fourth, survival stances such as blaming, placating, or withdrawing were reframed and reorganized into more flexible, congruent responses. The overall outcome pattern across studies showed reductions in anxiety and stress alongside increases in resilience, emotional clarity, and relational stability. This suggests that the Satir model reduces anxiety not by system management alone, but by strengthening the whole system in which anxiety is embedded. The review revealed strong global application of the Satir model across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. Across diverse contexts, consistent outcomes emerged. Improved family communication, reduced depressive symptoms, increased self esteem and coherence, stronger boundaries, and greater emotional attunement. Importantly, the model maintained its systemic depth while adapting to cultural norms, demonstrating both flexibility and integrity across settings. Across diverse cultural settings, the Satir model demonstrated strong cultural adaptability. In collectivist and hierarchical systems, concepts such as congruence and harmony were not experienced as opposites. Instead, they were integrated. Congruence did not mean individualistic expression at the expense of relational cohesion. It meant authentic communication within relational responsibility. This is an important insight because it positions the Satir model not as culturally bound, but as culturally responsive. The consistent global pattern suggests that Satir's emphasis on self worth, relational safety, and systemic balance translates effectively across different worldviews. This reinforces the model's relevance for contemporary global mental health practice. While many studies focused on stress and anxiety, depressive symptoms were also significantly addressed across contexts. The findings suggest that Satir-informed interventions impact depression not only at the level of mood, but at the level of self-worth, relational safety, and systemic functioning. This is important because depression in the Satir framework is not treated as a isolated intrapsychic disorder, but as a manifestation of disconnection, incongruence, and relational strain. The implications, therefore, extend beyond symptom relief to deeper systemic reorganization. Across multiple studies, consistent patterns emerged. There were significant reductions in depressive symptoms alongside increases in self worth and emotional regulation. Family functioning strengthened and internal coherence improved. A clear pattern became visible as congruence increased, depression decreased. When relational safety improved and embodied emotional integration strengthened, symptoms softened. This suggests that the Satir model addresses depression through restoring connection, restoring coherence, and systemic balance rather than through symptom management alone. Although the Satir model was developed decades before contemporary neuroscience, strong conceptual alignment has emerged. Satir emphasized emotional safety, co regulation, embodied awareness, and relational connection. These principles are now supported by research in neuroscience and attachment theory. This suggests that the model was intuitively grounded in processes that neuroscience is only now systematically validating. The Satir model aligns closely with several contemporary frameworks. Polyvagal theory highlights the role of safety and co regulation in nervous system stability. Satir placed relational safety at the center of change. Attachment theory emphasizes secure relational bonds. Satir focuses on strengthening connection and self worth within relational systems. Interpersonal neurobiology describes integration as the pathway to regulation. Satir conceptualized congruence as the integration of internal experience and external expression. Somatic psychotherapy emphasizes bottom up change. Satir consistently used experiential and embodied methods. Across these frameworks, a similar pathway appears. Experiential engagement supports embodied regulation, which increases relational safety and allows systemic transformation. In this sense, Satir anticipated what neuroscience now validates. These are striking parallels between the Satir model and contemporary parts work, particularly internal family systems. Satir's parts party mirrors the IFS understanding of internal multiplicity. Both frameworks recognize that the self is composed of different parts that carry roles, wounds, and protective strategies. Rather than pathologizing these parts, both approaches emphasize curiosity, compassion, and integration. Satir described the healing presence of a congruent self. IFS speaks of self energy, characterized by calmness, clarity, and compassion. Although developed independently, the conceptual resonance is strong. Several shared therapeutic synergies emerge between Satir and IFS. Both approaches aim for internal harmony rather than elimination of parts. Both strengthen emotional regulation by helping clients witness and integrate disowned or polarized aspects of themselves. Both support identity integration and increase personal agency. Ultimately, Satir and IFS converge on a central principle. Healing occurs when a coherent, compassionate self leads the internal system. This convergence further situates the Satir model within contemporary integrative psychotherapy dialogues. An important finding across the review was that meaningful change did not always require long term therapy. Several studies reported significant improvement within relatively brief interventions, often between 4 and 10 sessions. This is important because it demonstrates that the Satir model is not only depth oriented, but also practically applicable in time limited settings such as schools, community programs, and structured clinical contexts. The model appears capable of facilitating both rapid shifts and deeper systemic transformation. Across brief interventions, consistent outcomes were reported. There were reductions in depressive symptoms and anxiety, improvements in family communication, and enhanced emotional regulation. The tools most frequently used included the iceberg model, sculpting, congruence work, and experiential enactments. These methods allowed clients to access underlying emotions quickly, reorganize internal experience, and shift relational dynamics within a short time frame. The broader implication is that the Satir model is accessible, adaptable, and effective across multiple settings without losing its systemic depth. As I moved through the literature, one thing became very clear. The Satir model is not a closed system, it's a living framework. While the evidence base is growing, the research also highlights important areas of further development. The future of the model lies not only in continuing to demonstrate effectiveness, but in refining how we measure transformation, congruence, and systemic change. This is an invitation for the next generation of researchers and practitioners to deepen and expand the work. The review highlights several priorities for future research. We need more randomized controlled trials and longitudinal designs to strengthen the empirical base. We need clearer operational definitions of key constructs such as congruence and transformation. Cross cultural comparative studies would further illuminate how the model functions across different societal systems. There is also strong potential for incorporating physiological measures such as heart rate variability and stress biomarkers. And finally, integrating AI assisted process research could help us better understand moment to moment therapeutic change. The Satir model is evolving. It holds strong potential as a next generation integrative systemic framework that bridges relational depth, embodiment, and scientific validation. Now, here I would like to add a few slides on our recent article submission and position the Satir model as transformational systemic therapy. I want to begin with a simple observation. The Satir model is widely practiced across the world, yet it remains underrepresented in contemporary academic discourse. While it is frequently described as experiential, humanistic, or communication focused, it has not been sufficiently positioned within current systemic and evidence based conversations. The purpose of the study was to reposition the Satir model as a transformational systemic therapy, not merely as a set of techniques, but a coherent framework centered on congruence, relational healing, and the mobilization of inner resources. Although individual studies exist, there has been no comprehensive synthesis examining how the model works across contexts, cultures, and clinical populations. This review therefore asks two central questions. First, what evidence exists regarding its effectiveness? And second, and more importantly, how does transformation unfold within the Satir model? The intention is not only to evaluate symptom reduction, but to clarify the deeper processes of emotional, relational, and systemic change that define this approach. So, despite its global influence, the Satir model has remained under-synthesized as a coherent transformational framework. Much of the existing literature has focused on whether the model reduces symptoms. That is important, but it's not sufficient. This review deliberately shifts the focus, and the central question becomes not simply does it work, but how does transformation unfold within the Satir model? How do congruence, relational safety, emotional experiencing, and systemic shifts interact to produce change? By reframing the inquiry in this way, the study moves beyond outcome measurement and toward understanding process. This allows the Satir model to be seen not merely as a set of interventions, but as a systemic architecture of transformation. So, for this study, I conducted the systematic review of the literature following the PRISMA guidelines, as I said, and 21 studies were included. And this diagram illustrates the search and selection process. So the initial database search identified almost 6,000 records. After removing duplicates, 1,032 records remained for screening. Titles and abstracts were reviewed, and 845 records were excluded at this stage. A total of 187 full texts were assessed for eligibility. Of these, 112 were excluded, followed by further exclusions based on predefined criteria such as not being Satir-informed, lacking relevant mental health or systemic outcomes, insufficient methodological detail, not retrievable full texts, or translation inconsistencies. So ultimately, 21 studies met inclusion criteria and were included in the qualitative synthesis. Presenting the process visually reinforces the transparency and rigor of the review, and here you can see the graph. Each of the 21 included studies was appraised using CAS criteria to evaluate methodological rigor and risk of bias. The table you see here summarizes how each study performed across key domains such as clarity of aims, appropriateness of design, recruitment strategy, data collection, ethical considerations, and analytical rigor. Overall, the majority of studies were rated as medium to high quality, with several randomized and quasi-experiential designs demonstrating strong methodological structure. Some limitations were present, including small sample size, lack of long term follow up, and contextual constraints in certain settings. However, the overall pattern suggests that the existing evidence base, while still developing, is methodologically credible and sufficiently robust to support thematic synthesis. Importantly, quality appraisal was not used to exclude studies arbitrarily, but to interpret findings with appropriate critical awareness. So, across 21 studies, one consistent pattern emerged. The Satir model does not simply target isolated symptoms, it reorganizes the whole system. Whether the presented issue was depression, anxiety, stress, addiction, or relational conflict, change was never confined to one domain. Instead, shifts occurred across emotional regulation, relational dynamics, embodied experience, and meaning making. This systemic reorganization appears to be the underlying mechanism of symptom reduction. The findings clustered into four interrelated domains. Intrapersonally, emotional regulation strengthened, self esteem and congruence increased, and symptoms of depression and anxiety decreased. Relationally, communication clarified, boundaries stabilized, and attunement deepened within couples and families. Somatically, experiential and embodied work supported bottom up regulation. The body integrated what cognitive insight alone could not. And at the level of identity and meaning, clients reported greater authenticity, coherence, and an expanded sense of self. These domains did not operate independently, they interacted dynamically. The central insight of the review is that transformation unfolds simultaneously across emotional, relational, somatic, and existential levels. This reflects Satir's original holistic systemic vision. Change is not linear, it is layered. As congruence increases internally, relationships are reorganized. As relationships become safer, emotional regulation stabilizes. As regulation stabilizes, identity expands. This multi level integration appears to be the distinctive contribution of the Satir model. Now, in terms of core findings, this first group of studies primarily includes quasi-experiential and early control designs across Thailand, China, Iran, and Jordan. Most interventions ranged from 6 to 10 sessions to focus on depression, social anxiety, psychological distress, maladaptive communication, and relational patterns. Across these studies, we consistently see reduction in depression and anxiety, increased self esteem and emotional regulation, improved communication and boundary clarity, strengthened perceived social support. Even in small or short term designs, the pattern is not merely symptom reduction, it is intrapersonal strengthening combined with relational reorganization. Limitations at this stage include small samples, lack of long term follow up, and single site recruitment. However, transformational processes already appear layered. Self worth increases, emotional regulation stabilizes, communication becomes more congruent. This section introduces greater methodological diversity, including psychometric validation of the perceived self, transformation scale, randomized controlled trials, intensive experiential workshops, communication focused family interventions, dance movement therapy applications, VR assisted communication training. Here we see stronger experiential designs, including multiple RCTs. Outcomes expand beyond symptom relief to include increased self transformation and spirituality, reduced codependency, improved coping and emotional regulation, enhanced empathy, increased resilience during COVID. Notably, experiential and somatic mechanisms become more visibly in these studies. Embodied movement, experiential workshops, and immersive communication training suggest that affective and relational change are activated through lived experience rather than cognitive restructuring alone. Limitations still include short follow up periods and non clinical samples in some trials. And the final group includes hospital based RCTs, family based interventions, single case clinical studies, correlational research, and conceptual analysis. Here we see significant reductions in depression, anxiety, and self harm indicators, improvements in family cohesion and validation, reduced internet addiction, strengthened parent child relationships, enhanced social competence, integration of spiritual and existential dimensions. Importantly, this section highlights systemic reorganization at the family level. Boundaries reorganize, family validation increases, caregiving roles differentiate, and emotional support expands. The conceptual papers extend the empirical findings by articulating Satir's alignment with meaning making and spiritual integration. Even where empirical rigor is low, the transformational pattern remains consistent. Emotional regulation, relational restructuring, and identity expansion unfold together. So, what this research confirms, and it is part of the discussion, across 21 studies, the most consistent finding is that Satir model facilitates transformation at multiple levels simultaneously. What stands out is that change is not limited to symptom reduction. While depression, anxiety, stress, and maladaptive behaviors decrease, these improvements appear embedded within broader systemic shifts. Emotional regulation strengthens, relational patterns reorganize, communication becomes more congruent, embodied awareness increases, and at a deeper level, identity and meaning expand. This suggests that the Satir model operates at a transformational framework rather than a symptom focused intervention. The experiential and congruence based processes seem central to its impact. Clients do not simply think differently, they experience themselves and others differently. At the same time, the evidence base remains developing. Many studies rely on small samples, short follow up periods, and geographically clustered populations, particularly in Asia and the Middle East. Future research would benefit from larger, randomized controlled trials, longitudinal designs, and studies that explicitly investigate mechanisms of change, particularly the role of experiential, somatic, and relational processes. Overall, the findings support repositioning the Satir model as a coherent, transformational, systemic approach grounded in multi level integration. And this slide summarizes the core mechanisms that appear to drive transformation within the Satir model. At the center, it's the model itself. Congruence enhances affect regulation. Model demonstrates cultural adaptability. The self is positioned as a healing resource. There is strong emphasis on relational healing, and the use of multi-level interventions reflects the holistic design of the model. Together, these elements explain why transformation appears layered and systemic rather than linear and symptom-based. So, rather than revisiting the mechanisms of change, the conclusion shifts our lens outward. This review suggests that the Satir model is not a historical or peripheral approach, but a theoretically coherent and clinically integrative framework. Its emphasis on congruence, relational restructuring, embodied processing, and identity integration aligns closely with contemporary developments in systemic and experiential therapies. Although the empirical base is still growing, it's sufficiently consistent to warrant deeper scholarly investment. Repositioning the Satir model within modern systemic discourse may broaden how transformation change is conceptualized and practiced. So, one of the most exciting overlaps is with somatic science. And Satir didn't use this term, but she taught us how, to track the breath, the posture, the tone of voice, and to tune in through our bodies. Today, we know congruent connection improves heart rate variability, an essential biomarker for resilience. It supports oxytocin release and activates mirror neurons for synchrony. Satir's embodied presence was ahead of her time, and now science is catching up. Incorporating elements from the Satir model, such as validation, support, and emotional connection, can further enhance the therapeutic process. The emphasis on the movement is in the Satir model aligns with the polyvagal theory's notion of activating the nucleus ambiguous and regulating striated muscles, ultimately facilitating a return to the ventral vagus state and promoting overall well-being. Let's take a moment to explore one of Satir's most visionary tools, the parts party. Long before internal family systems therapy became known, Virginia invited clients to engage their inner parts, not as problems to fix, but as parts of the self seeking voice, function, and peace. Her focus was on internal harmony and congruence, what we might now call self leadership. In a qualitative study by Tsui Chung, 2004, in Hong Kong, clients reported that Satir interventions like sculpting and parts work helped them experience greater emotional regulation, clarity, and compassion toward themselves. The power here lies in witnessing. When clients see their parts as pathology, not as pathology, but as adaptive messengers, they gain both insight and agency. This mirrors many insights from IFS, showing just how far ahead Satir's humanistic wisdom truly was. The brief interventions. Many assume that deep change takes years, but here's what the research shows. In as little as 4 to 8 sessions, Satir tools make measurable difference. Whether it's sculpting a family dynamic, guiding a person through their iceberg, or activating their internal resources, the model delivers impact fast. That's why it's finding new life in executive coaching, short term therapy, and even school based programs. The future frontiers, biomarkers, and research. Imagine this: a client sculpts their inner family, their HRV improves, their oxytocin rises. We track it in real time. This is the future of therapy, where the intuitive depth of Satir work meets data. We can bring congruence to the lab and make it visible. AI tools may even help analyze language for congruent patterns. To get there, we need bridges between researchers, practitioners, and technologists. So the science is ready, are we? Integrative applications, blended Satir with today's models and living framework. Satir model doesn't compete, it completes. It integrates beautifully with approaches like IFS, EFT, somatic experiencing, mindfulness, narrative therapy, and CBT. Wherever there is a focus on inner resources, on presence, on relationship as a healing field, Satir fits. And what makes it unique is the combination of structure, warmth, body mind integration, and transcendence. It's not just a tool, it's a living framework that continues to grow. The practitioner researcher bridge, we need both intuition and evidence. You, as a practitioner, listening to this, Hold the keys to this model's future. Your work, your insights, your case notes. These are research. We don't need to become academics, all of us, but we do need to document, to validate, and to share what works. Because when we link heart and data, Satir's legacy becomes unshakable, not just anecdotal, but empirical. And what this means for our community, a model for the next generation. This is not just about research, it's about legacy. How do we ensure that Satir's model doesn't get reduced to just a diagram or acronym? We pass it on with spirit, with science, and with systems in place. We bring in the next generation. Let's give them a model that's deep, dynamic, and defensible. And some closing reflection. Science with Soul, Virginia's vision today. This is the heart of the Satir model. Not just techniques, not just frameworks, but presence, being seen, being heard. That is what our research must serve. The Satir model is not just effective, it is sacred. Let us honor it by continuing to grow it, evolve it, and carry it forward. And I'm inviting you to connect with me. Here's my phone number for a WhatsApp or an email, website. Let's connect and keep the legacy alive. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.